Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of let me just say, I see some unfamiliar faces. My name is Margot Nishimura. I'm the Deputy Director of the John Carter Brown Library, and on behalf of our Director, Neil Saphir, who could not be here today, I'd like to welcome you to this Wednesday's afternoon talk. I have a few announcements, as is customary, before I hand over the lectern to our speaker. I want to remind you that following our recently established convention, we will reconvene after the end of the talk and an opportunity to look at materials up here at the English Cellar Ale House on Angel Street for pizza and beer. So I hope everyone here is welcome to join us. And if you don't know where the ale house is, we actually have little maps at the back of the room on the table where you came in this afternoon. So please join us there for some refreshments. Next week, June 18th, at same place, same time, we will reconvene for Christopher Tozzi's talk. Christopher is our Jane L. Keddy Memorial Fellow currently at the library. He is an assistant professor of history at Howard University, and he will be talking on punishment en masse, power, identity, and violence in the post-revolutionary Caribbean. Today's talk, we welcome back a friend of the JCB's, Chet Van Duzer, who is an independent scholar and was, in 2011, the Jeanette Black Research Fellow. He is also currently a JCB invited research scholar, but has also held fellowships elsewhere, including the Kieslak Fellowship at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Chet has published extensively on medieval and Renaissance maps in journals such as Imago Mundi, Terra Incognita, and Word and Image. He's also the author of Johann Schöner's Globe of 1515, Transcription and Study, the first detailed analysis of one of the earliest surviving terrestrial globes to include the New World, and with John Hessler, Seeing the World Anew, the radical vision of Martin Waldseemüller's 1507 and 1516 world maps. His book, one of my favorites, there you go, Sea Monsters on medieval and Renaissance Maps, was published last year by the British Library, and this year the Library of Congress will publish a study of Christopher Columbus's Book of Privileges, which Chet co-authored with John Hessler and Daniel de Simone. His current book project is the commentary for a facsimile edition of the 1550 manuscript world map by Pierre de Cellier in the British Library. And today's talk, we're going to hear Portraying the World Anew, Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina, 1516. So if you will help me welcome back to the JCB, Chet Van Duzer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margot, and thank you all for coming, and please bear with my voice today. I have the pleasure of talking today about two of the most important maps of the 16th century, those by Martin Waldseemüller, his world maps of 1507 and 1516, focusing on the 1516 Carta Marina, which we see here. All the attention usually goes to the 1507 map, which is famous for being the first to apply the name America to the New World. We see it here. The two maps are both printed on 12 sheets. We can see that here. So the same physical format, the same physical size, but what I'm going to argue today is that the maps could not be more different in all other respects. And I'll do that by comparing and contrasting them, which is the best way to bring out the distinctive characteristics of the 1516 map. I'll begin by talking about two different types of maps, two different cartographical systems. The first is the maps in manuscripts of Ptolemy's geography. The geography was written in the 2nd century AD in Alexandria, Egypt, which at that time was culturally Greek. The book consists of instructions for making maps and a very long list of some 8,000 place names, of which we see a few here, with their latitudes and longitudes. And that was how Ptolemy organized space. It seems obvious, it seems inevitable to us now, but when Ptolemy's geography was rediscovered in Europe in the 15th century, it was a very exciting and important development because that system of organizing space had been lost for centuries. Here's the Ptolemaic map of Italy. I'll point out that the interior is dense with geographical detail, and I'll also highlight around the edges the scales of latitude and longitude. So that's how Ptolemy organizes space. And here is a Ptolemaic world map. It takes a moment to orient oneself, but I've indicated the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And we can see that there's a land bridge joining southern Africa with southern Asia that runs across the lower edge of the map that makes of the Indian Ocean a lake. Of course, that land bridge does not exist, but Ptolemy believed it did, and it was one of the biggest errors in his maps. And just to quickly show another Ptolemaic world map that places a greater emphasis on the grid of latitude and longitude, which again is how Ptolemy organizes space. The second system of cartography I'd like to discuss is that of nautical charts. This is the area shown on a typical medieval nautical chart. So the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, east of the Holy Land, west of the Atlantic, and usually north to a bit of Scandinavia. And now I'm going to switch to a nautical chart that shows that same area, but again, it takes a moment to orient oneself. I've indicated Spain and Italy. The Red Sea in the lower right-hand corner is helpfully painted red. And the green thing snaking across northern Africa is the Atlas mountain chain. So this is a fairly heavily decorated nautical chart, and I'm going to show an undecorated nautical chart. This really shows the essential elements of a nautical chart, which are the emphasis on coastal features. We can see the place names written perpendicularly to the coast, with the most important ones in red, and the system of rhumb lines that radiate out from these points. They radiate out in the standard compass directions or wind directions, and I want to emphasize that those points, the nodes of that system of lines, are organized in a circle. In this chart, it's one circle. In some larger charts, it's two circles, but they're always in a circle, and we'll come back to that later. And again, these are not lines of latitude and longitude. These are rhumb lines, and the function of rhumb lines in navigation is not entirely clear. We don't have a contemporary text with some of these maps, early 15th century, that explains how they were used. But the thing I want to lay emphasis on is that it's not a system of latitude and longitude. So we'll have a quick look at Waldseemüller's 1507 world map, and what I'll show is that the 1507 map is based on Ptolemy, and the 1516 map is based on nautical charts. So here is the 1507 map. Again, it's 4 by 7.5 feet. It's very impressive. The only surviving exemplar is at the Library of Congress. It's worth seeing at some point. It attracts most of its attention for its depiction of the New World, and as you can see, it shows water to the west of the New World well before the official discovery of the Pacific by Balboa in 1513. That's occasioned quite a bit of discussion. Was there a pre-discovery of the Pacific? I personally don't believe that, but a lot of ink has been spilled on the question. And of course, it's very well known for being the first map to apply the name America to the New World. And so it's been called the birth certificate of America, and this is why the Library of Congress paid $10 million for the map, so the most expensive map ever purchased. Waldseemüller is very clear about his debt to Ptolemy in this map, and that's clear even in the title. He says, "A map of the whole world according to the tradition of Ptolemy and the explorations of Amerigo Vespucci and others." And he also indicates his debt to Ptolemy with a portrait of Ptolemy along the upper margin of the map. And what I want to show is that the 1507 map is based on a specific map that's based on Ptolemy. And that map is the so-called Yale Martellus map, a world map made by Enricus Martellus in about 1491, which resides at the Beinecke Library at Yale. And if we put the two maps one above the other, you can see that they share the same projection. It's a modification of Ptolemy's second projection. So again, both maps are based on Ptolemy, They both are based on the grid of latitude and longitude. And what I'm going to argue is that it was this specific map that's based on Ptolemy that Waldseemüller was using as a model. If we look at a few details, we can see the same system for indicating latitude in the margin of the map. Both cartographers take advantage of the large space left in the lower corners of the map by the curve of the projection to insert large text blocks. The shape of northern Africa is the same on the two maps, in both cases based on Ptolemy. Even more impressive is the similarity of Eastern Asia on the two maps. And this is important because it's not based on Ptolemy, it's based on Marco Polo. And Marco Polo does not indicate latitudes and longitudes. So these maps have exactly the same rendering of Marco Polo, the same cartographic rendering of Marco Polo. And in particular, the two maps place Japan in exactly the same, not only geographical location, but also it's at the eastern edge of both maps, so it's in the same location in terms of layout. I've also been able to show that many legends on the two maps are the same in the same locations. I don't have time to go into that today, but really the case for Waldseemüller having had direct access to either this specific map or another one by Martellus is really very convincing. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to the Carta Marina and talk about the development of Waldseemüller's cartographic thought. Here is the Carta Marina. Again, it's of the same size, same format, if you will, as the 1507 map, but in every other respect, it's different. And I'll start out showing that. And I would also argue that in many ways it's a more interesting map. I think it better repays close study. It's a much more original map and much more detailed. The first thing I'll show is that while the 1507 map is based on Ptolemy, the 1516 map is based on nautical charts. So here they are, and again, my point here is that they are completely different despite their similarity of physical size. So again, the title of the 1507 map indicates that it's based on Ptolemy, and the title of the 1516 map indicates a radical departure, a complete rejection of classical authorities. The title reads, "A nautical chart that comprehensively shows the Portuguese voyages and the shape of the whole known world, its regions and its limits, as they have been determined in our times, and how they differ from the tradition of the ancients, and also areas not mentioned by the ancients." So this is a radical departure from basing the map on Ptolemy to completely rejecting Ptolemy and all other ancient authorities. And so he calls it a nautical chart. He says it's Carta Marina, it's a nautical chart. And in fact, it's based on a specific nautical chart, the one we see here, the Niccolo de Caverio map of circa 1503 or 1504. It's not dated, which is in the National Library of France. It's another large format map. And it's easy to show the dependence of the Carta Marina on this map. If we put one above the other, many of the elements are in the same locations and have the same shapes. So Greenland is in the same location, has the same shape. The so-called Pseudo-Labrador Island in the Atlantic. The shape of the coast of South America. The central location and shape of Africa. The two distinctive peninsulas jutting southward in Asia. And the locations of the nodes of the Rum Line network are the same on the two maps. So there really can't be any doubt that Waldseemüller was using this map as his model for the coastlines. As we'll see later, he doesn't use it for everything, but he does use it for the coastlines. So another important difference between the 1507 and 1516 maps is which discoverer, which explorer is given credit, fullest credit for the discovery of the New World. On the 1507 map, it's Vespucci. There's a portrait of Vespucci at the top margin of the map. There was a pamphlet printed to accompany the map that includes accounts of Vespucci's 4 voyages, and the conception of the New World depicted is that of Vespucci. Vespucci clearly says the New World is an island, and that is one of the important sources of Waldseemüller's depiction of the New World with water to the west of it. The case is very different on the Carta Marina. He does not show any water to the west of the newly discovered lands in the west. And on this map, he's also very clear, he's come to realize that it was not Vespucci who was the first discoverer of the New World, but rather Columbus. And he has a list of his sources on the map, and he does not list Vespucci at all, he lists Columbus. And on another text on the Carta Marina, he very clearly says that Christopher Columbus of Genoa was the first, and he actually says that Vespucci was the third. And we can see that different conception of the New World in this, this northern part of the New World. We can see that the text says, the land of Cuba, part of Asia. So Vespucci was very clear that the New World was an island. Columbus believed that he was in, his aim was to get to Asia, and he believed that he was in Asia, and he went to all sorts of mental gymnastics to convince himself of that. So the conception of the New World on this map is that of Columbus. So at the top of the 1507 map, there are images of what Waldseemüller regarded as his two most important sources. Ptolemy, well, in the Carta Marina, he's rejected Ptolemy and now is using the nautical chart system of cartography. He's also rejected Vespucci as the first discoverer of the New World and now has realized that it's Columbus. So the two figureheads of his 1507 map have gone by the wayside just 9 years later. It is really very dramatic. Another important difference between the two maps, the 1507 map very boldly portrays all 360 degrees of the Earth's longitude, that is, its whole circumference, at a time when much of that was unknown. The 1516 map portrays about 2/3 of that, so leaving off 1/3 of what he had depicted on the earlier map. And another related feature is that the margins of the 1507 map, because of the projection, are much wider. They take up a much higher percentage of the map's surface than they do on the 1516 map. The combination of those two elements, the fact that he's not showing as much of the Earth's surface, and that even though the physical area of the maps are the same, the portion of it devoted to depicting the Earth is greater in the Carta Marina, means that he is, in effect, creating a zoomed-in image of the world. He can show more detail, and he takes full advantage of that. Here's Arabia on the 1507 map. It shows place names, mountains, and rivers, and that's about it. And this comes straight from Ptolemy's geography. Here's Arabia on the 1516 map. It's a much richer depiction of the region. It has images of cities, not just place names. It has an image of a sovereign. I don't know if you can see him in the lower right there. And long descriptive texts. He's talking about Medina and Mecca. He's giving a much richer panoply of information on this map. Where did all this come from? Well, one place it did not come from was the map that he used as his model for the coastlines of the Carta Marina, this map by Caverio. Here's Asia on the Caverio chart, and you can see that the hinterland, the interior, is just about empty of geographical detail. There's almost nothing there. There's some decorative flourishes, there's a scale of miles, some compass roses, but really almost nothing in the way of geographical detail. I'm now going to show exactly the same part of the Carta Marina. So it's completely different. He has filled it with information that was not available at all on his source map. The difference is so striking it's worth showing again. So here's the hinterland of Asia, empty on the Caverio map, and again, exactly the same area of the Carta Marina. So it's filled with images of sovereigns, long descriptive texts, mountain ranges, rivers. It is a very, very rich document. So where did all this information come from? Well, Waldseemüller undertook a very long and detailed research into all the latest travel narratives and cosmographies that he could get his hands on, and also other maps that he could get his hands on, and chose the texts and the images that he could use to fill in the details in this map. So one of his important sources was the collection of travel narratives called the Paesi Novamente Ritrovati of 1507. Another was the travel narrative of Balthasar Springer of 1509, a German who traveled with the Portuguese to India. And another was Ludovico di Varthema's travel narrative. There were a few different editions. This is not the earliest one, but this was the specific edition that Waldseemüller used. So all these texts were published just shortly before the map, this one just 1 year before his map. On the 1507 map, the information about Asia came, by way of the Martellus map, from Ptolemy and Marco Polo. So the information from Ptolemy in 1507 was about 1,200 years old. The information from Marco Polo was about 300 years old. And it's easy to imagine Waldseemüller's excitement at being able to provide information that had come to him from explorers who had been to these regions in just the last few years. It's a complete, radical updating of his image of Asia. So to look at an example of that updating, this is the island of Taprobana on the 1507 map in the Indian Ocean. It's usually equated with Sri Lanka, although that's debated. If we zoom in a little bit, so we have the 1507 map on the right and a manuscript of Ptolemy's geography on the left, you can see that the island on the 1507 map comes right out of Ptolemy. It's the same shape, it's on the equator, surrounded by the same islands. The case is very different on the Carta Marina. So going back to the Cavario chart, Waldseemüller's source for his outlines of lands on the Carta Marina, I've circled Taprobana. And then zooming in, you can see the name, Taprobana, written on the island. And now I'm going to switch to showing exactly the same portion of the Carta Marina. There is the island in exactly the same location, but its name is different. So Waldseemüller has not only used a much more recent map, one created just a dozen years before the Carta Marina, he's even updated that. There's a long text just above the island that explains that the island of Taprobana is best identified with Samotra or Sumatra. So he's used this more recent map and then even updated that. Another instance of this updating, so here's Persia on his 1507 world map. It's straight out of Ptolemy. Here's Persia on his 1516 map, and we can see this depiction of Sophie Rex. Sophie is the founder of the Safavid dynasty, and he took control of Persia in the year 1500. So here the information is 16 years old as opposed to 1,200 years old. Oops, sorry about that. And Waldseemüller also did everything he could to use not only the most recent texts and information available to him, but also the most recent images. So this is a depiction of the opossum in South America. And this is actually the earliest European depiction of an opossum that's come down to us. Waldseemüller no doubt copied it from a print or a drawing that he'd seen, so it was certainly not the earliest made, but it's the earliest one that survives. So it shows him using the most recent materials available to him. Here's the rhinoceros on the Carta Marina. It comes from Hans Bergmer's Rhino, a print made in 1515. Again, this was published just 1 year before the map. Waldseemüller's image of Mecca on the Carta Marina comes from actually the image of Medina in the 1515 edition of Varthema's Travels. I suppose he used an image of Medina for Mecca just because he wanted to use an image for the better known of the two cities. But the important thing is, it's from a book published just 1 year before the map was finished. Waldseemüller's image of the practice of suti in India, whereby a widow throws herself on the funeral pyre of her husband. In this case, the poor woman is not engaged in this very willingly. But again, the image comes from that of suti in the 1515 edition of Varthema. Again, a source published just 1 year before the map. I want to talk about this image, which shows King Manuel of Portugal riding a sea monster. And it's located just off the southern tip of Africa. And let me see if I can, yeah, here he is again. The purpose of this image is to show Portugal's control of the sea route from Portugal around Africa to India. And it shows King Manuel controlling this dangerous element of the sea monster, as a way of expressing Portugal's control of that sea route. Well, it's worth contrasting the depictions, or rather the way sea monsters are deployed on the two maps. On the 1507 map, there's half a dozen legends about sea monsters in the Indian Ocean. They come from medieval sources by way of Martellus, and they indicate that the sea monsters there are dangerous. So the sea monsters are something that would discourage navigation. Here, the image is entirely different, and I would suggest that these two maps, made just 9 years apart, reflect a revolution in Waldseemüller's conception of the ocean. It's gone from being a place of danger to a place that humans can control and where trade can be conducted. So it's a remarkable change in outlook in just 9 years. And I would suggest that in general, the Carta Marina is a more pragmatic map than the 1507 map. It doesn't show the whole Earth's circumference when a large portion of that was unknown. It shows the parts that are known best. And there's also an emphasis on practical details. So for example, in the lower right-hand corner, there's a long text, which I'll zoom in on here, that discusses the sources and prices of spices in Calicut, India. Nothing could be further from the 1507 map and its data from Ptolemy, which is 1,200 years old. I mean, if Ptolemy had listed the prices of spices, they would obviously have been of absolutely no help whatsoever in 1507 or 1516. So, to get to conclusions, I think one thing I've been able to show is that Waldseemüller was always most comfortable working from a model map. And in the case of his 1507 map, he based it on Martellus's map and sort of bolted on the New World and the West. In the case of his Carta Marina, he based it on the Cavario chart, but underwent this long process of doing research in all the latest travel narratives to cull the information with which to fill those outlines. So the Carta Marina is the fruit of more than a decade, really, of thinking about the best way to portray the world. It's based on a cartographic system that was actually used by navigators rather than Ptolemy's more theoretical approach. And it contains practical information about trade, political information, even the prices of spices. So it reflects this great drive to disseminate the latest cartographic, ethnographic, trade information throughout Europe. Thank you very much.
I'll start out.
Sure.
And I know you'll have lots more questions for sure. And before you're done, I also want you to talk about what you selected to look at afterwards. But can you talk a little
Margot,
bit more?
could you
I'm
speak
sorry.
up a little? Sorry, please. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Chet, can you talk a little bit more about how the map was actually physically made and who was responsible for the design elements and the cutting of the wood blocks and how many pieces there were, a little bit about the workshop production, the context of production.
We're starting off with the hard questions. I wish we had more information about that. It's printed on 12 large sheets. Well, you can see there's a facsimile of the map out there. 12 large sheets. We don't know who cut the blocks. I don't personally have any doubt that it was Waldseemüller himself who was choosing, for example, the images and choosing the texts. But I'm also pretty sure it was not Waldseemüller who was doing the cutting, which is of a high caliber. We don't even know where the map was printed. It was probably Strasbourg, but we don't have the definitive evidence of that, unfortunately. So there's a lot of open questions about the map.
Chet, thanks very much. This is fascinating. And one very probably elementary question is, in the 1507 you have the projections, and you mentioned that Ptolemy was working off longitude and latitudes, which would make a big potato chip work. How does that work? Because later when he flattened it out and made it without those important inflections.
Yes. So the nautical charts have been called projectionless. I don't agree with that denomination, just because any time you transfer information about a sphere to a plane, by definition there's a projection involved. I think it's better to call it a naive projection. So on a nautical chart, the lines of latitude and longitude are simply perpendicular throughout. So it's not very sophisticated at all. The projection on the 1507 map is much more mathematically sophisticated. So the question arises as to why did Waldseemüller make this switch? And I think it was simply because the information on nautical charts was much more recent. It was based on recent navigations, whereas Ptolemy was based on information that was 1,200 years old. Yes, Anush?
It's so fascinating. Thank you, Chet. I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's excited by the presence of crisis current on the map. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, because I wonder how that kind of offers another way of thinking about this text as something more than a map, which sort of begs the question of who is the audience for this sort of massive work.
Yeah. So the question is, who was the audience for this if it's including prices for spices? The prices for spices, I was initially puzzled by that as well. They come from that book I mentioned, the Paesi Nuovamente Ritrovati, copied with some minor errors. But yeah, the interesting thing is the audience. So the map is so large that it was not designed to be taken to sea. And also it's on paper. Paper would not fare well in the salt air environment of a multi-year voyage to India, so that you could pull out your sheet and say, okay, I'm expecting to pay this amount for this spice. So it's actually a difficult question, who was the audience? I mean, I think it's directed at scholars. It's the descriptive texts are in Latin, and there's a lot of them. It was something that was designed for study. How exactly the prices of spices in Calicut, thousands of miles away, helps someone in studying in Germany is not super clear to me. So that's something I continue to think about. That's a great question. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the archival research you've done on Waldseemüller and other cartographers? Were they writing letters? Were they writing to each other about this? How can you make the inferences that you're making?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's only, I believe, one letter by Waldseemüller that survives, and it's not particularly interesting. There's one letter in which a contemporary records buying the 1507 map, together with the pamphlet printed to accompany it and the little globe made to accompany it. But there is very little in the way of archival information that sheds light on these maps, and part of the reason for that, I suppose, is that Saint-Dié, the town in eastern France where Waldseemüller was working, was destroyed at the end of World War II, which is a great loss. Yes.
I was struck by Ptolemy's representation of the Indian Ocean as a lake and a land bridge from southern Africa to where might that idea have come from?
Well, yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. At that time, the communication between the Indian Ocean and Alexandria was so little that any depiction of the Indian Ocean was based on little tidbits of information in this grand extrapolation. So I don't know what Ptolemy heard that led him to believe that it was basically a large lake, but it's an extrapolation of some little bit of information he heard.
So you pointed out that in Persia and India, he's using 1515 information. But then when you get to the New World, he ignores all the exploration that had been done, including the Pacific Ocean, and reverts back to 1492, which doesn't make any sense on your theory that he was eager to use the most up-to-date. So how do you explain what he did there?
Well, eagerness is one thing, but access is another. So in this case, as I showed, the depiction, the outlines of the New World are copied from this map from 1504. So I think in his mind, that was pretty recent. He went back, you can say he went back to Columbus's conception of the New World, which we now know is not correct, but back then, you know, there was no good basis for distinguishing between the idea that these new discoveries were connected to Asia and the idea that they were not. And in fact, maps continued to depict the New World as connected to Asia for 60 years. So it's not a simple question at all. It took generations to figure out what this thing was that had been discovered.
Even though the Spanish are sailing around.
Even though the Spanish are
Getting to the
sailing
other
around.
side.
Yes. So again, enthusiasm is one thing, access is another. You don't always have access. Waldseemüller had access to tremendous books, maps, but he didn't have access to everything. And he didn't have access to everything he wanted to have.
You didn't mention the Rice map, the Admiral
Peary Rice?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Did that have any influence on it?
I don't think so. I don't see any evidence that he would have had access to that. I've been able to adduce evidence that he did have access to particular maps, but I haven't seen any evidence that he had access to that one.
Columbus didn't know how around the Earth, or how the distance around the Earth was drawn. Was that corrected by the time this was done, or is that also much later?
It was later. I don't have in mind the exact, or a good date for that, but certainly not by this time. No.
In longitude, there was a lot of work done on longitude in, the 17th century, but still the concept of longitude was a really early concept.
The concept of longitude, yes, is very early. I mean, Ptolemy was convinced that that was the way to organize space, was to know the latitude and longitude of each point, but determining it was another matter. And that you had to have an accurate clock that would keep time at sea. And in the early 16th century, that was simply not available.
So how inaccurate are these maps?
How inaccurate?
Yes.
Very. Very inaccurate. I mean, the accuracy is best in the Mediterranean basin, and as you go further from the Mediterranean basin, it tends to fall off a bit.
Chet, will you tell us a little bit about what's out? And
Yes. So at the end of the table is a facsimile of the Carta Marina. It's so large that we couldn't really unfold it all. But there's a white strip of paper underneath one of the images on the map, that of Suti. And then the book from which Waldseemüller took the image is displayed just above the map. And that's one of just 2 copies of that book in North America, so we're very fortunate to have it here at the JCB. And then here is the 1513 edition of Ptolemy's Geography, for which Waldseemüller made the maps. So Waldseemüller made his 1507 map. This was a multi-year project, the 1513 Ptolemy, but in many ways the maps in it are transitional between his 1507 map and his 1516 map, and I'll say a couple words about that. So it's an edition of Ptolemy. It has the 27 standard Ptolemaic maps, but then it has 20 more maps, which are based on nautical charts, modern maps. So this shows Waldseemüller at a point where, okay, Ptolemy's great, I'm doing an edition of Ptolemy, but these nautical charts are fantastic, I have to include them too. And then when he got to make his 1516 map, he realized that the superiority of the data on nautical charts was just too great, he had to use those. So this is something in between, not just chronologically, but also in terms of thought process, the 1507 and 1516 maps.
The size of the map would have limited is the number of people who could have bought it and used it. Is this presumed that it would have been for somebody extremely wealthy and a king or something? Or?
Well, it's a printed map. So the manuscript map on the top here, that was something for a noble, for certain. But the Carta Marina was printed, so it was a dissemination of some of the same information in that manuscript map. The cost of the Cavario chart at that time would have been, I don't know, just pull a number out of the air, 20 ducats. The cost of the Carta Marina would have been maybe a tenth that. So it was at least purchasable by a much wider audience. Whether one had space on one's wall was another matter.
Well, thank you, Chet, and we can all now enjoy a little look at the materials.
Thank you.